"Can I sweep your house in exchange for a place to sleep?" He refused, but when he saw who it was, Margaret Johnson felt her legs tremble as she knelt at the gate of the most imposing mansion in Aspen. Her worn-out clothes contrasted sharply with the property's elegance, and her calloused hands clasped together in silent pleading. Just then, she saw the man hurry out of the house, adjusting the knot of his expensive tie while carrying a leather briefcase. Summoning every last ounce of courage, Margaret called out to him. "Please, sir," she shouted, making Richard Anderson stop mid-stride toward his imported car. "I can sweep your house in exchange for a place to sleep. That's all, I beg you." Richard didn't even look at her directly. His cold eyes quickly scanned the kneeling woman before he shook his head impatiently. "I don't need any help," he replied curtly, continuing toward the automatic gate already beginning to open. Margaret struggled to her feet and ran after him, clutching the sleeve of his Italian suit. The desperation in her voice was palpable. "Please, I'll do anything. Clean, cook, tend the garden. I just need a corner to rest my head." Richard pulled away with a sharp motion, shoving her back. The woman stumbled but didn't fall. She just stood there, watching him enter the black Lexus and speed away without a backward glance. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, but Margaret remained frozen in place. Silent tears fell onto the well-kept asphalt of the mansion's driveway. Then, she heard a gentle voice from the gate. "He never helps anyone," whispered Mrs. Eleanor, the 68-year-old housekeeper who had worked there for over 2 decades. Her grey hair was tied in a simple bun, and her pristine white apron contrasted with the pity in her brown eyes. Margaret stepped closer to the iron bars, gripping them tightly. "Have you worked here long?" "Since he was married," Eleanor replied, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "But that changed 15 years ago. After his wife left and took the little girl, he turned to stone. Doesn't care to help a soul." "He has a daughter." "Had," the housekeeper corrected, her voice heavy with sorrow. "A beautiful little girl with the bluest eyes I've ever seen. But her mother vanished with her one night, left nothing but a note. The master hasn't been the same since." Margaret tightened her grip on the bars, her knuckles turning white. What was she like? The girl. Eleanor studied the woman's face curiously. "Why do you want to know?" "Just curious," Margaret lied, averting her gaze. The housekeeper hesitated before sighing. Brown, curly hair just like her father. But her eyes, those were her mother's, blue as a summer sky, had a dimple in her right cheek when she smiled. And she smiled a lot back then. Margaret closed her eyes, as if the description stirred some old pain inside her. "What was her name?" "Isabel," Eleanor answered. "Isabel Anderson. Why all these questions?" But Margaret was already walking away, moving slowly down the tree-lined street. Eleanor watched until she disappeared around the bend, a strange feeling settling in her chest. The next day, promptly at 7 in the morning, Margaret was back at the gate. Richard left at his usual time, wearing another impeccable suit, the same stern expression on his 52-year-old face. "Mr. Anderson," she called, but he didn't slow his pace. "I said I don't need anyone," he replied without looking at her. "But I'll work just for food. You don't have to pay me anything." Richard stopped abruptly and turned, his dark eyes flashing with irritation. "Listen carefully. I don't want beggars loitering around my property. If you keep showing up here, I'll call the neighborhood watch." Margaret Johnson felt the sting of his words but didn't move. "I'm not a beggar, sir. I'm a woman who's fallen on hard times, but I'm not a beggar." "Whatever you are, I don't care," Richard Anderson shot back, getting into his car and slamming the door. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Margaret stayed there until the car vanished completely. Then she sat on the curb in front of the mansion and studied the property. The house was truly impressive. 3 stories, perfectly manicured gardens, a fountain in the center of the yard, and huge windows reflecting the morning sun. Mrs. Eleanor appeared at the gate again, this time holding a cup of coffee. "Are you going to stay there all day?" "If I have to," Margaret replied, gratefully accepting the hot coffee. "What's your name?" "Margaret Johnson. And yours?" "Eleanor." I've worked here since I came from Colorado 23 years ago. I've never seen the boss change his mind about anything. Then I'll have to find a way to make him, Margaret said, taking a sip. This coffee is delicious. Thank you. Do you have children, Margaret? The question made Margaret pause, the cup halfway to her lips. I did, she answered softly. A daughter. What happened to her? Margaret took her time answering, as if each word cost a piece of her soul. Life took her from me, a long time ago. Eleanor noticed the deep pain in the woman's voice, but didn't press further. Instead, she offered a small sugar bun she'd brought. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days. Weeks, Margaret corrected, accepting the bun with tears in her eyes. Thank you for your kindness. Richard returned home at 6 in the evening, as he always did since his wife left. He found Margaret still sitting in the same spot, now whispering with Eleanor through the gate. Still here? He asked, stepping out of the car impatiently. I thought I made myself clear yesterday. You were very clear, sir, Margaret replied, standing slowly. But I need to be clear too. I won't give up. Give up on what exactly? On getting a job in this house. Richard laughed bitterly. And what makes you think I'd change my mind? Because everyone deserves a second chance, even you. The answer caught Richard off guard. No one had spoken to him that way in years. A second chance at what? At being human again, Margaret said, looking him straight in the eye. Richard felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he'd buried long ago, but he quickly pushed it away. Eleanor, I don't want to see this woman talking to you again. Understood. Yes, sir, the housekeeper replied, though her tone made it clear she disapproved of her employer's attitude. Richard went inside, slamming the door, leaving Margaret and Eleanor alone outside. He wasn't like this before, Eleanor murmured. When Mrs. Laura was here, he used to smile. He'd play with Isabel in the garden. He'd sing in the shower. What changed, besides them leaving? Everything. He stopped seeing friends, stopped going out, stopped dating. He lives only for work and this empty house. It's like he buried his soul along with his dreams. Margaret gazed at the mansion's windows, imagining life inside. Do you think he still loves his ex-wife? I think he loves the idea of what they had, but mostly he loves the daughter he lost. Her room is still untouched, you know. No one's allowed in there, not even me to clean. On the second floor? Eleanor stopped and looked at Margaret in surprise. How do you know it's on the second floor? Margaret realized she had said something she shouldn't have. I figured. In houses like this, the children's rooms are always on the second floor, away from the commotion. That's true, agreed Eleanor, but she continued watching Margaret with curiosity. On the third day, it poured rain. Margaret arrived at the gate soaked, shivering from the cold, but as determined as ever. Richard saw her from the living room window while having his breakfast and felt a pang of something that might have been guilt. Eleanor rushed out with an umbrella, but it was too late. Margaret was shaking so badly she could barely stand. My goodness, you'll catch pneumonia, the housekeeper exclaimed. I can't get sick, Margaret replied, her teeth chattering. I need to be here when he leaves. He's already gone. He had an early meeting today. Margaret looked at the empty garage, her face showing deep disappointment. So he didn't see me today? Oh, he did. He was at the window when you arrived. Something in Margaret's expression changed, a spark of hope. And he still left without acknowledging me. You don't understand how hardened he's become, but come inside and dry off, or you'll freeze to death. I can't enter the property without his permission. I'll give you permission. I've worked here longer than some people have lived. Eleanor opened the gate and practically dragged Margaret inside. She led her through the back of the house straight into the spacious, cozy kitchen. Sit here by the stove, she instructed, turning on all the burners. I'll get you a towel and dry clothes. Margaret sat on the rustic wooden chair and looked around the kitchen. It was bigger than some apartments she'd lived in. White tiles, oak cabinets, a dining table for 8, a pantry that looked like a small supermarket. But what caught her attention most was a small photograph stuck to the refrigerator. It showed a girl about 8 years old smiling and holding an ice cream cone. The child had curly brown hair and bright blue eyes. Margaret stood slowly and approached the photo. Her hands trembled, and not just from the cold. "That's Isabel," Eleanor said, returning with a fluffy towel and a set of clothes. "It was my favorite picture of her. The boss doesn't know I kept a copy." "She is beautiful," Margaret murmured, gently touching the glass of the frame. "Are you all right? You've gone pale all of a sudden." Margaret quickly stepped away from the photo. "Just the cold. May I change?" "Of course. Use the bathroom over there. And don't worry, the boss won't be back until evening." When Margaret came out of the bathroom wearing the borrowed clothes, Eleanor was preparing a plate of hot food. "Vegetable soup and homemade bread. You need to eat properly." "Thank you, Eleanor. I don't know how to repay such kindness. Tell me about your daughter," the housekeeper asked, sitting at the table. "I noticed how you looked at Isabel's photo." Margaret hesitated, stirring the soup without eating. "Did she look like Isabel?" "Very much." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Same hair, same eyes, same dimple when she smiled." Eleanor looked confused. "How do you know about the dimple? I didn't mention that yesterday." Margaret realized another mistake. "All pretty children have dimples," she tried to deflect. "No, ma'am, Isabel had a very specific mark. Just one dimple on her right cheek, right here." She pointed to her own face. It was the sweetest thing in the world. The fork slipped from Margaret's hand and clattered onto the plate. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked, concerned. "Sorry, I'm still shaking from the cold." But Eleanor was starting to notice strange things. How Margaret knew details about the house, how she reacted to information about Isabel, how her eyes welled up every time the girl was mentioned. "Margaret, may I ask you a direct question?" "Of course." "Have you been in this house before?" The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Margaret looked at Mrs. Eleanor, then at the kitchen around her, then back at the photo of Isabel on the refrigerator. "Why do you ask?" "Because you act like you know this place, and you react to everything about Isabel as if she mattered to you too." Margaret rose from the table, walking to the window overlooking the backyard. "Everyone thinks they know the full story of other people's lives," she said, without turning around. "But the truth is, we never know even half of it." "What truth, Margaret?" Before she could answer, they heard the sound of a car pulling in. Richard had come home early. "Oh dear, he can't find you here," whispered Mrs. Eleanor, panicking. "Then I'll leave right now." "There's no time. He's coming in through the front." Mrs. Eleanor pushed Margaret into the pantry, shutting the door just as Richard walked into the kitchen. "Mrs. Eleanor, why are you so nervous?" he asked, noticing the housekeeper's agitation. "Nervous? Who's nervous?" "I'm not nervous, sir." Richard glanced around the kitchen and spotted 2 dirty plates on the table. "Did you have company?" "Oh, I just ate twice. You know how it is, age catches up and you forget you've already eaten." She laughed nervously. "Mrs. Eleanor, you're lying to me." The housekeeper sighed, knowing it was no use trying to fool Richard. "The woman who comes here every day arrived soaked from the rain. I felt sorry for her." "And where is she now?" "She left." "Mrs. Eleanor." "Fine, she's in the pantry. But before you explode, hear what she has to say. There's something strange about this woman." Richard marched to the pantry and yanked the door open. Margaret stood there, still wearing borrowed clothes, her damp hair framing her pale face. "How dare you enter my home?" he shouted. "It's my fault, sir," Mrs. Eleanor interjected. "I let her in. And you," he pointed at Margaret, "are trespassing." "I know," she replied, stepping out of the pantry with dignity. "And I apologize, but I didn't come here for no reason." "I don't care why you came. I want you out now." "Richard Anderson," Margaret said, using his full name for the first time. Something in the way she spoke his name made Richard stop shouting. "How do you know my full name?" "I know many things about you." "Like what?" Margaret looked around the kitchen, then fixed her eyes on Isabel's photo. "I know you have a doll stored in the attic, an old porcelain doll with a blue dress and white ribbons." Richard's face instantly paled. How do you know that?" "Because that doll belonged to your daughter. It was Isabel's favorite toy." Richard staggered, bracing himself against the kitchen counter. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" "I want to work in this house for a week. In return, I'll tell you everything I know about Isabel, about where she might be, about why Laura took her away. You know where my daughter is? Richard's voice came out strangled. Maybe, but I'll only talk if you give me a chance. Richard looked at Mrs. Eleanor, who watched wide-eyed. 1 week, he finally said. But you don't go beyond the first floor, and I want answers every day. Deal. And I want to know who you really are. By the end of the week, you'll know everything, Margaret promised. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Richard spent the entire night awake, pacing back and forth in his room. The mention of the doll had shaken him deeply. That toy really had been Isabel's favorite, and it had been stored in the attic for 15 years, exactly as Margaret had described. But how did she know? Only 3 people knew that detail. Him, Laura, and Isabel herself. And only he knew where the doll was kept. The next morning, Richard came down earlier than usual and found Margaret in the kitchen, already wearing an apron and making coffee. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I didn't sleep at all. And you? How did you get in here?" "Eleanor gave me a backdoor key. I arrived at 5 in the morning to start working." Richard looked around and noticed the kitchen was even cleaner than usual. The floor gleamed, every surface was spotless, and there was a fresh lemon scent in the air. "You cleaned all this in an hour?" "2. I started with the living room." Richard walked into the living room and was stunned. Every piece of furniture was shining, every ornament in its perfect place, every cushion arranged with military precision. "How did you know where everything goes?" "A woman's intuition," Margaret replied, appearing behind him with a cup of coffee. "Coffee just how you like it, strong, no sugar, in a white porcelain cup." Richard took the cup with trembling hands. "How do you know how I take my coffee?" "That's the first piece of information I'll give you. But first, I want to know something. Do you really not remember me?" Richard studied her face intently. Margaret was around 45, with brown hair streaked with grey, tired but still beautiful green eyes, delicate features despite being too thin. "Should I remember? 20 years ago I worked at your office. Impossible. I never had an employee with your name. Because my name wasn't Margaret back then." Richard nearly dropped the cup. "What was your name?" "Marina Wilson. I was your personal assistant." Richard's world stopped. Marina Wilson, the 25-year-old woman who had been his assistant for 2 years, the woman he had fallen madly in love with, despite being married, the only person who had made his heart race in 2 decades of a lukewarm marriage. "Marina," he whispered, studying her face again. "Now you remember?" Richard let the cup fall. It shattered on the marble floor, scattering coffee and porcelain everywhere. "No, it can't be you." Marina had black hair. She was different. 20 years change a person, Richard, especially when they go through what I've been through. But you disappeared. One day you just didn't show up for work. I never saw you again. Because I found out I was expecting a baby. Your baby. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard leaned against the wall, feeling his legs weaken. "A baby? Our baby?" "A girl, beautiful as an angel, just like her father." Where is she?" "That's a long story, Richard, and a painful one." Eleanor walked into the room, saw the broken cup and the shock on both their faces. "Did something happen?" "Eleanor," Richard said, his voice hoarse, "do you remember Marina, my assistant from 20 years ago?" The housekeeper looked at Margaret and her eyes widened. "Good heavens, that's why you looked familiar. But you were very different back then." "You remember her?" Richard asked. "Of course. Miss Marina used to come here to pick up documents you forgot. A lovely, polite young woman. Miss Laura didn't like her much." "Why didn't Laura like her?" Eleanor glanced nervously from Richard to Margaret. "Because, well, it was pretty obvious there was something between you two." Richard ran his hands through his hair, trying to process everything. "Marina, tell me everything, from the beginning." Margaret sat on the living room sofa, her hands trembling slightly. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. You were married, I was just an assistant. I decided to quit without any explanation. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid of your wife's reaction, of your reaction, of losing my job, and on top of that, causing problems in your marriage." "You should have told me," said Richard, sitting down beside her. "Maybe, but I made the decision I thought was right at the time. I left for Colorado to my older sister's house." "And the baby?" "She was born healthy, a perfect little girl, with your blue eyes and curly hair. I named her Isabel." Richard felt his heart stop. "Isabel? Like your grandmother's name, the one you always spoke of so fondly." But my daughter's name is Isabel." "The daughter I had with Laura is named Isabel." Margaret smiled sadly. "Because she wasn't Laura's daughter, Richard. She was our daughter." The world collapsed around Richard. He stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across the room. "That's impossible. Laura got pregnant 2 years after you left. Isabel is her daughter. Laura could never get pregnant, Richard. You two tried for years before I even joined the company, remember?" Richard stopped pacing. It was true. He and Laura had tried for years to have children without success. "Then how?" "When my sister got sick and could no longer take care of Isabel, I came back to New York City. I was struggling, without a steady job, living off the kindness of others. One day, Child Protective Services showed up at the house where I was staying and took my daughter." "Why?" "Because someone had made an anonymous report that I wasn't fit to care for her. I didn't have my own home, no registered job, no family to support me." "And what happened to her?" "She was put up for adoption, and guess who adopted her?" Richard sank heavily into the armchair. "Laura. Your wife was desperate for a child. She had connections in the adoption system. And when she saw a beautiful, healthy 2-year-old girl, she didn't hesitate to take her in. But she never told me it was an adoption. She always pretended Isabel was her biological daughter, because she knew you'd suspect. Isabel looked too much like you for it to be a coincidence, and Laura didn't want to risk you finding out the truth and wanting to track down her birth mother." Mrs. Eleanor, who had listened in silence until now, finally spoke. "That explains a lot. Mrs. Laura was always overly protective of Isabel. She wouldn't let anyone ask questions about her pregnancy, and she always changed the subject when someone mentioned how much the girl took after her father. Richard was devastated. For 15 years, I believed I had a daughter with Laura, and in reality, she was my daughter with you. And I spent 15 years searching for her," said Margaret, tears streaming down her face. "When I found out she'd been adopted by the Andersons, I started investigating. I discovered where you lived, but it took me years to gather the courage to come here." "Why didn't you come sooner?" "Because I was afraid of how you'd react. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, and I was afraid of ruining Isabel's life if she was happy. And when Laura took her away, that's what finally gave me the courage to show up. Because I realized you were suffering just as much as I was, that you'd lost our daughter too." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Isabel used to play. "She loved planting flowers right there." He pointed to a flower bed near the fountain. "She said she wanted a huge garden when she grew up." "She always loved plants," Margaret confirmed. "Even as a toddler, she'd try to plant bean seeds in yogurt cups." Richard turned to her. "Do you remember her when she was little?" "I remember everything. Her first smile, her first steps, her first word. And then I remember nothing, because she was taken from me." The silence that followed was heavy with pain and guilt. Richard sat back down, this time closer to Margaret. "Are you sure she's our daughter? I have all the documents. The original birth certificate, where you're listed as the father. Papers from the adoption process. Even photos of her as a baby, where the resemblance to you is undeniable. Did you bring these things? They're hidden in a safe place. I can get them tomorrow if you want to see." "I do. I need to see everything." "Richard," Margaret said softly, "I know this must be a shock. I know it's a lot to take in. But you need to understand one thing. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came because we're the only ones who can find our daughter." "Do you really think we can find her?" "I have faith we can, but I need your help. You have resources, connections, influence. Alone, I've tried everything and gotten nowhere." Richard stayed quiet for a long time, processing everything he'd heard. Finally, he looked at Margaret with a softer expression. "Forgive me for how I've treated you these past few days. If I had known..." "You couldn't have known. I've changed a lot. Life hasn't been kind to me." "What happened to you all these years?" "After I lost Isabel, I fell into a deep depression. I lost job after job, couldn't focus on anything. I spent 2 years in a psychiatric facility." "Margaret, when I got out, I tried to rebuild my life. But with every job I took, every place I lived, I thought of Isabel. I wondered if she was okay, if she was happy, if she remembered me." "How did you find out where she was?" "By chance. 3 years ago, I saw an article in the paper about you. It was a feature on successful businessmen in New York City. There was a photo of you with Laura and a teenage girl. When I saw her face, I knew instantly it was my daughter." "Why did it take you 3 years to come here?" "Because I spent that time gathering proof, organizing documents, trying to find the courage. And also because I wasn't in any condition to face you. I was a wreck, financially, emotionally." "And now? Are you better?" Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "Now I'm in the worst place of my life, but I'm also more desperate. When I heard Laura had run away with Isabel, I knew it was now or never." Richard stood and reached for her hand. "We'll find our daughter, Marina. I promise you." "Margaret," she corrected. "I changed my name after I left the facility. Marina died when she lost her daughter. Now I'm Margaret." "Then we'll find our daughter, Margaret." That night, Richard couldn't eat. He locked himself in his office and spent hours staring at old photos of Isabel, now seeing not just his own features in her, but traces of Margaret too. The dimple in her right cheek was just like Margaret's when she was young, the way she tilted her head when deep in thought, the mischievous smile when she was up to something. How had he never noticed before? How had he been so blind? Around 2 in the morning, he went downstairs for a glass of water and found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, gazing at a photo of Isabel on the fridge. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "I haven't slept right in 15 years, she replied, not taking her eyes off the photo. "Every night I wonder where she is, if she's okay, if she has friends, if she's studying, if she has a boyfriend." Richard sat beside her. She was fine when she left. A normal teenager, a little rebellious but happy. Good grades, lots of friends. "Tell me more about her. What was she like?" "Smart. So smart. Questioned everything, wanted to know how things worked, and stubborn as me." Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving. "When she was little, she took apart every toy to see what was inside. Drove me crazy. She still did that. Took apart the whole school computer when she was 12, just to see how it worked." "And what else? What was she like as a person?" "Affectionate, very affectionate. She always hugged everyone, always concerned if people were okay. And creative. She loved to draw, to make up stories. She used to draw a lot when she was little too. Mostly happy families. Father, mother and daughter holding hands." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "Why do you think Laura ran away with her?" "Fear," answered Margaret without hesitation. "Fear that one day you'd discover the truth. Fear that I'd show up to take my daughter back. Fear of losing the girl she loved as if she were her own." "Do you think Laura truly loved Isabel?" "I'm sure she did. She may have done everything wrong. She may have lied to you and to her, but she had real love for our daughter. And that gives me hope that she's taking good care of her." "So you're not angry at Laura?" Margaret stayed quiet for a long time. "I am angry. Angry that she kept the two of you from me. Angry that she stopped me from watching my daughter grow up. But I'm also grateful, because I know she gave Isabel a life I couldn't give her at the time." "And now, what do you want to happen when we find Isabel?" "I want to meet the woman my daughter has become. I want her to know she has a birth mother who never stopped loving her. And I want her to decide for herself what kind of relationship she wants with me." "You don't want to take her away?" "Richard, Our daughter is 20 now. She's an adult with her own life and choices. I just want the chance to know her and for her to know me. Richard was struck by Margaret's maturity. I thought you'd want to make up for lost time. Lost time can't be recovered. But the time we still have ahead, that can be built into something beautiful. They talked until dawn, sharing memories of Isabel, filling in the gaps in each other's stories. Richard told her about the first time the girl called him Dad, how she loved bedtime stories, how she cried on her first day of school. Margaret shared about their daughter's first 2 years, the sleepless nights when she was sick, her first words, how Isabel used to laugh when she saw little birds outside the window. When Mrs. Eleanor arrived for work at 6 in the morning, she found them still talking in the kitchen, surrounded by photo albums Richard had brought down from the bedroom. You stayed up all night. We had 15 years of catching up to do, Richard replied. So now, what's the plan to find Isabel? Richard looked at Margaret. First, we'll go through all the documents you have. Then I'll hire a private investigator, the best one I can find. I've already tried private investigators, said Margaret. I spent all my savings on them. But now you have resources, my resources. We'll hire as many as it takes. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That same afternoon, Margaret returned with a bag of documents. Richard examined each one carefully. Isabel's original birth certificate, listing him as the father, photos of her as a baby, where the resemblance to him was undeniable, adoption paperwork, medical records, even a few baby clothes Margaret had kept all these years. My God, Richard murmured, holding a tiny pink shirt. This outfit. Isabel wore one just like it when she was 3. I always wondered where Laura had bought it because it looked used. Because it was. It was from when she was 6 months old. Richard looked at all the documents scattered across his office desk. There's no doubt. Isabel is our daughter. And now we'll use every resource possible to find her. Richard called the best private investigator in New York City, a man named Dr. Henry Mitchell, who had a reputation for finding missing people in impossible cases. Dr. Henry, this is Richard Anderson. I need your services for a very important case, a personal one. The investigator arrived the next day, a man in his 60s with graying hair and sharp eyes. Richard and Margaret told him the whole story. It's a complex case, Dr. Henry said, examining the documents. Do you have any leads on where Laura might have gone? She had a sister in Washington, D.C., Richard remembered, and she often talked about a small town in Colorado where she spent her childhood. I'll start there, but you need to understand, finding someone who doesn't want to be found takes time, and when we do find them, the situation might be complicated. Complicated how? Margaret asked. Laura might have told Isabel a different version of the story. She might have created new identities for both of them, and Isabel might be happy with the life she has now. We understand, Richard said, but we have to try. I'll start the investigation today. I have contacts in multiple states. If they're in the country, I'll find them. As they waited for news from the investigator, Richard and Margaret began living together in the mansion. It was strange at first. 2 strangers who had once been close, now bound by the pain of a shared loss. Margaret kept her word about working in the house. She cleaned, cooked, and organized everything with almost obsessive care. Richard noticed she did it as a form of therapy, a way to stay busy while they waited. You don't have to do so much, he said one afternoon, finding her polishing every piece in the dining room's crystal cabinet. Yes, I do. It helps keep me from going crazy with worry. Margaret, can I ask you something? Of course. Why have you changed so much? When you were Marina, you were different, happier, more alive. Margaret stopped cleaning and sat in one of the dining room chairs. Have you ever lost a child, Richard? I did, when Isabel left. Then you understand. But imagine losing a child while knowing they're alive somewhere, yet you can't see them, can't touch them, can't even know if they're okay. It's a constant torture. I'm sorry. For what? For not being there when you needed me, for not helping you raise our daughter, for letting all this happen. You didn't know, Richard. If you had, I'm sure you would have acted differently. I would have. I would have left everything to be with you both. Even though you were married? Richard was quiet for a moment. Even though I was married, because you two would have been my real family. 2 weeks later, Dr. Henry called with the first lead. I found records for Laura Anderson in Boston, he said over the phone. She's using her maiden name, Laura Parker. And there are records of a 20-year-old woman with her, named Isabel Parker. Richard and Margaret exchanged glances, their hearts racing. Where exactly are they? Richard asked. In a residential neighborhood in Boston. Laura works as a teacher at a private school. Isabel is studying education at the State University. Education? Margaret whispered, tears in her eyes. She wants to be a teacher. I'll send you the address, but I advise caution. You can't just show up at their door. What do you suggest? Richard asked. Observation first, learn their routine, see how they're living, then plan a careful approach. When Richard hung up the phone, he and Margaret stood silently looking at each other. We found our daughter, he finally said. We found her, she replied, but her voice didn't sound relieved. It sounded frightened. What's wrong? What if she doesn't want to meet us? What if she's happy without us? We'll find out, but we won't give up now. Richard and Margaret traveled to Boston the next day. Dr. Henry had reserved a hotel near the neighborhood where Laura and Isabel lived and had already scouted the area. They live in a simple but well-kept house, the investigator explained. Laura leaves every morning at 7 for work. Isabel has afternoon classes, so she leaves around 2. And at night? Margaret asked. They stay home, sometimes going for walks in the neighborhood park. They seem to have a quiet, normal life. Richard and Margaret spent 2 days just observing from a distance. On the third day, they saw Isabel for the first time. She was leaving the university in the late afternoon, carrying a backpack full of books and chatting animatedly with a friend. She was taller than Richard remembered, her hair cut a little shorter, but she was undeniably the same girl he had raised. It's her, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. Our daughter. Richard couldn't speak. He just watched the young woman he hadn't seen in 5 years, noticing how she had grown into a beautiful and seemingly happy woman. She looks well, he finally managed to say. She really does. And happy. They watched Isabel say goodbye to her friend and board a bus. Then they followed the bus in their car until they saw her get off near the house where she lived. Now what? Margaret asked. Now we get to know the neighborhood. We'll familiarize ourselves with the places she frequents, and we'll plan how to approach her. In the following days, Richard and Margaret discovered that Isabel had a fairly regular routine. She studied at home in the morning, went to the university in the afternoon, and sometimes spent evenings at a nearby diner studying with friends. She's always been studious, Richard remarked, watching his daughter through the diner window. And sociable. She has plenty of friends around her. How do you think we should approach her? Margaret thought for a moment. Naturally, no lies, but no shocks either. Maybe by frequenting the same places she does, letting her get to know us little by little. As strangers? As people interested in the school she attends, you could pretend you're considering making a donation or something like that. Richard liked the idea. And you? I can introduce myself as someone interested in the education program. Maybe say I'm thinking about going back to school. They put the plan into action the following week. Richard introduced himself at the university as a businessman interested in learning about the education program for a potential partnership. Margaret enrolled as an auditor in a few classes. That's how, on a Thursday afternoon, Margaret found herself sitting in the same classroom as her daughter. Isabel was in the third row, paying attention to the lecture on child development. Margaret sat at the back of the room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. When the class ended, Margaret stood up slowly, gathering her materials. Isabel passed by her on the way out, and for a moment, their hands brushed. Sorry, Isabel said, smiling. It's nothing, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time in 15 years she had touched her daughter. That night, Richard found Margaret crying in their hotel room. What happened? She touched me. By accident, but she touched me and she smiled at me. Richard held her, feeling his own tears begin to fall. How is she? Beautiful, Smart, polite. Laura did a good job raising her. And that makes you sad? No. It leaves me grateful, and at the same time heartbroken, because I lost all of that. They continued attending the university for 2 weeks. Margaret sat in on several classes with Isabel, and Richard visited the institution a few times to discuss partnerships. It was during one of these visits that Richard finally spoke to Isabel. She was in the library studying alone when he approached her. "Excuse me, are you in the education program?" Isabel looked up from her books, and Richard felt the world stop. It was like looking at a feminine version of himself 20 years earlier. "Yes, I am. How can I help you?" "I'm considering making a donation to the program and would like to understand how it works. Could you explain a bit?" "Of course." Isabel closed her book and gave him her full attention. "The program is excellent. The professors are highly qualified, and the curriculum is very comprehensive." Richard asked several questions about the program, but in truth he was just watching his daughter speak. He noticed how she gestured when excited, how she bit her lip when thinking, how her eyes sparkled when talking about education. "Have you always wanted to be a teacher?" he asked. "Always. Ever since I was little, I played school. My mother says I used to teach math to my dolls. Your mother must be very proud of you." "She is. She's a teacher too. She says she's the one who inspired me." Richard felt a pang of jealousy, but pushed it away. "And your father? What does he think of your choice?" Isabel hesitated for a moment. "My father doesn't live with us anymore. It's been a few years." "I'm sorry." "It's all right. Actually, he wasn't my biological father anyway. My mother told me I was adopted when I was little." Richard nearly choked. "Your mother told you you were adopted?" "Yes. She said my birth parents couldn't raise me at the time, so they gave me up for adoption, and that she and my adoptive father chose me because they really wanted a daughter." "How do you feel about that?" "At first it was hard to accept, but now I understand they gave me the best life they could. I'm grateful for that." "Have you ever thought about looking for your birth parents?" Isabel was quiet for a long moment. "I have, especially after my adoptive father left. But my mother gets very sad when I bring it up. I think she's afraid of losing me." "And you? Are you afraid too?" "A little. I'm afraid that if I search, I'll find out they don't want to know me, or that they're bad people, or that their lives don't have room for me." Richard wanted to tell her everything right then, but held back. What if they were good people? What if they really wanted to meet you? Then it would be wonderful, but I think that only happens in movies. When Richard returned to the hotel, he told Margaret everything. "She knows she was adopted," he concluded, "and she wants to meet us, but she's afraid." "And Laura, how does she feel?" "She's afraid of losing Isabel. That's why she doesn't encourage the search." Poor Laura. She must have been tormented for years. Richard looked at Margaret in surprise. "You feel sorry for her?" "I do. She loves our daughter, Richard, and she's suffering at the thought of losing her. I understand that feeling. What do you think we should do?" "I think it's time we talk to Laura." "Are you sure?" "Yes. This game of hide and seek has gone on long enough. We're all suffering. It's time to lay our cards on the table." Richard agreed, but they both knew it would be one of the hardest conversations of their lives. They decided to approach Laura on a Saturday afternoon, when she usually did her grocery shopping at the neighborhood supermarket. Richard and Margaret waited for her in the parking lot, their hearts racing. When Laura came out of the supermarket pushing a cart, Richard approached. "Laura." She turned and nearly dropped the cart when she saw him. "Richard, what? How did you find me?" "We need to talk." It was then that Laura noticed Margaret standing beside him. Her eyes widened, and she turned pale. "Marina? Are you Marina?" "I go by Margaret now, but yes, it's me." Laura looked from one to the other, then glanced around the parking lot as if searching for an escape route. "You came to take Isabel." "We came to talk," Richard said. "All of us." "She doesn't know you're here?" "No, but I think it's time she learned the truth." the whole truth. Laura leaned on the shopping cart, her legs shaking. "You're going to take her from me." "No one is taking anyone from anyone," Margaret said gently. "Laura, Isabel is 20 years old. She's an adult. The decisions are hers now. But you're her biological parents. She'll want to stay with you." "And if she does, will you accept that?" Richard asked. Laura began to cry. "I love her as if she were my own flesh and blood, more than anything in my life." "I know," Margaret said, "and she loves you too. That will never change." "How do you know?" "Because we've been watching the two of you. We see how she looks at you, how she cares for you. You're her mother, Laura. The mother who raised her, who was there for her, who taught her. No one can take that away." Laura cried even harder. "I always knew this day would come. I've always been afraid." "Why did you run away with her?" Richard asked. "Because I found out Marina was looking for you. Someone told me a woman was asking questions about you at the company. I was afraid it was her, and if it was, I'd lose Isabel." "You could have talked to me," Richard said. "You could have told the truth." "And what would you have done? Chosen between your biological daughter and your wife?" Richard fell silent because he didn't have an answer. "Besides," Laura continued, "I was afraid you'd want Isabel back, and I couldn't live without her." "We understand," Margaret said, "but now she's an adult, and she deserves to know the truth. Are you going to tell her?" "We'll tell her together," Richard suggested. "All three of us, so she understands the whole story. What if she's angry with me for lying all these years? Then you'll talk it out and work through it. That's what families do," Margaret said. Laura looked at her in surprise. "You consider me family? You're the mother who raised my daughter. That makes you the most important person in her life, after herself. Of course I consider you family." At that moment, something shifted in Laura's expression. The fear gave way to relief. "All right. We'll tell her everything. But I choose how and when." Agreed. Laura asked for a day to prepare and gather her thoughts. On Sunday afternoon, she called Richard. "Come to the house now. I'm going to tell Isabel everything." Richard and Margaret drove to Laura's home with their hearts in their throats. It was a simple two-story house with a small but well-kept garden in front. Laura greeted them at the door, visibly nervous. "She's in the living room. I told her I had a surprise for her." When they entered the room, Isabel was sitting on the couch wearing a simple dress with a curious expression on her face. "Isabel," Laura said, her voice trembling slightly, "I want you to meet two very important people." Isabel looked at Richard and Margaret, and something in her face changed, as if somehow she already knew. "This is Richard Anderson, and this is Margaret Johnson," Laura continued. They're your biological parents." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabel looked at the three adults in front of her, processing the information. "My biological parents?" she repeated slowly. "Yes," Richard answered, stepping forward. "I'm your father, and Margaret is your mother." Isabel stood up from the couch and walked to the window. "All this time you were looking for me?" "I was there," said Margaret, "from the day you were taken from me." "And I didn't even know you existed," added Richard. "Until 2 weeks ago, I didn't know you were my biological daughter." Isabel turned to Laura. "Did you always know?" "Always," admitted Laura, tears in her eyes. "And I was always afraid of this moment." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid of losing you. You're everything to me, Isabel. I can't imagine my life without you." Isabel went back to the couch and sat down heavily. "I need to understand everything, from the beginning." And so, for the next 3 hours, Richard, Margaret, and Laura told the whole story. Every detail, every lie, every heartache, every decision made out of love or fear. Isabel listened in silence, asking occasional questions, but mostly trying to process it all. When they finished, she stayed quiet for a long time. "So to sum it up," she finally said, "my birth mother searched for me for 15 years. My birth father thought I was his wife's daughter. And my adoptive mother ran away with me because she didn't want to lose the child she loved." "That's right," Richard confirmed. And all of you suffered all these years. We did, Margaret admitted. Isabel looked at Laura. Mum, do you love me? More than my own life? Then she turned to Margaret. And you? Do you love me even without knowing me? I've loved you since before you were born, and I've loved you every day for these 20 years, even without being by your side. Finally, she looked at Richard. And you? I raised you for 15 years believing you were my daughter. Then I spent 5 years missing you. Now I find out you really are my daughter in every way. I can't even begin to explain what I feel. Isabel stood up and went to each of them. She hugged Laura first. Thank you for raising me, for loving me, for giving me the best life you could. Then she hugged Richard. Thank you for being my father all these years, for teaching me to ride a bike, for coming to my school performances, for comforting me when I cried. Lastly, she hugged Margaret. And thank you for never giving up on finding me, for loving me even from afar. When they pulled apart, everyone was crying. So now what? Laura asked. Now we'll be a different kind of family, Isabel said. A family with 3 parents and 1 daughter, and we'll make it work. Are you sure? I am. I've spent my whole life feeling like something was missing. Now I know what it was. It wasn't love. I always had more than enough from Mum. It was wholeness, the other pieces of the puzzle. Richard looked at Margaret, then at Laura. That means we'll all have to learn to live together. It does, Isabel agreed. And it won't be easy. There'll be jealousy, arguments, hard moments. But there'll also be so much love. And that's what matters. Margaret took Laura's hand. Are you in? I am. But on one condition. Isabel stays living with me until she finishes college. I accept that, Richard said. But you two are moving to New York City. I'll buy you a beautiful house near mine, and Isabel will transfer schools. I don't want you spending money on me, Laura protested. It's not spending. It's investing in the family we're building. Isabel smiled, and in that smile, Richard and Margaret saw the little girl they'd lost and the woman she'd become. Then it's decided, we'll be the most complicated and most beautiful family in the world. 6 months later, the 3 women were living in a spacious house in New York City, just 15 minutes from Richard's mansion. Isabel had transferred colleges and loved her new professors. Laura got a job at an excellent private school, and Margaret was in therapy, rebuilding her life. Richard visited every day, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to help Isabel with her college assignments. At first, it was strange for everyone. Laura was jealous of the time Isabel spent with Richard and Margaret. Margaret felt guilty for stealing moments that belonged to Laura. Richard didn't know how to balance his love for his daughter with respect for the woman who had raised her. But little by little, they found their rhythm. They established family traditions, like Sunday dinners together, family outings, birthday celebrations, and holidays. Isabel became the bridge between them all, helping each understand the other's feelings, mediating conflicts, reminding everyone that love doesn't shrink when shared, it multiplies. A year after the reunion, on a Sunday afternoon, the 4 of them were in the garden at the women's home. Richard was teaching Isabel how to plant rose bushes, Margaret was preparing a snack, and Laura was reading a book in the shade. Dad, Isabel said suddenly. Richard stopped working the soil. Yes? Thank you for finding me. I didn't find you, sweetheart. Your birth mother found you. I was just lucky enough to be in the way. Isabel looked over at Margaret, who was cutting fruit on the porch. Mom, Margaret, she called. Margaret lifted her head. Yes, dear? Thank you for never giving up on me. Margaret smiled, wiping tears with her apron. I would never give up on you. Then Isabel turned to Laura. Mom, Laura? What is it, my love? Thank you for raising me with so much love. Laura closed her book and walked over to them. It was the greatest honor of my life. Richard stood, brushing dirt from his hands. You know what I'm thinking? What? The 3 women asked in unison. That life is funny. Sometimes it separates people who should be together. But if the love is real, it finds a way to bring everyone back. Do you think it was fate? Isabel asked. I think it was love. Margaret replied, stepping closer to the group. Love always finds a way. And now, Laura asked, what does the future hold for this crazy family? Richard looked at the three women in his life, the daughter he'd lost and found again, the ex-wife who had become a dear friend, and the woman he'd loved in the past and who was now part of his family in a whole new way. Now we take it one day at a time, he said, looking out for each other, making happy memories and always remembering that family isn't just about blood. Family is who chooses to stay and make it work. Isabel looked around at the three adults who loved her, each in their own unique and special way. So we're a real family. The realest there ever was, Richard answered. And for the first time in 20 years, all the pieces of the puzzle fit perfectly. 2 years later, Isabel graduated with honors in education. At the graduation party, she stood radiant on stage, while in the audience, 3 people cheered for her as if she were the most important person in the world. Richard, Margaret, and Laura sat side by side, standing to applaud when Isabel's name was called. She did it, Margaret whispered, tears of pride in her eyes. She did, Laura agreed, and she's going to be an amazing teacher. Just like her mother's, Richard said, looking at the 2 women beside him. After the ceremony, at the celebration dinner, Isabel gave a speech none of them would ever forget. I want to thank the 3 people who made me who I am today, she began, standing at the restaurant table. To my father, Richard, who taught me that love knows no barriers and that family is about choices, not just genetics. Richard discreetly wiped his eyes. To my mother, Laura, who raised me with so much love that I never lacked anything, especially affection and solid values. Laura smiled through her tears. And to my mother, Margaret, who taught me that true love never gives up, even when all seems lost. Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. You 3 are proof that love can heal any wound, can unite any family, and can overcome any obstacle. Thank you for teaching me that there's no greater or lesser love, just different love, and that a family can be built in many different ways, as long as it's built with true love. When she finished her speech, the 4 of them embraced in a group hug that lasted several minutes. I love you, said Isabel. We love you too, the 3 replied in unison. At that moment, looking at that unique and special family, anyone passing by the restaurant would see 4 people who had found what everyone searches for. A place where they belong, people who love them unconditionally, and the certainty that, no matter what happens, they will always have each other. The story that began with a desperate woman begging for work in exchange for shelter had turned into the most beautiful family love story anyone could imagine. Richard never felt alone in the big mansion again, because now it was always full of life, laughter, conversations, and the comforting noise of a family that chose to stay together. Margaret regained not only her daughter, but also her reason for living. She smiled again, dreamed again, and believed once more that life could be good. Laura discovered that a mother's love doesn't diminish when shared, it grows, and that she hadn't lost a daughter but gained a bigger family. And Isabel learned that a person could have more than one mother, more than one source of love, and that it didn't make her confused or divided, it made her blessed. 5 years after the reunion, on a sunny Saturday morning, the 4 of them were in the garden of Laura and Margaret's home, which they now shared in harmony, when Isabel made an announcement that left everyone speechless. I have news for you, she said, smiling in a way they didn't recognize. What news? Asked Richard. You're going to be grandparents. The silence that followed was pure shock and joy. Grandparents? Repeated Margaret. I'm pregnant. 3 months. Richard was the first to react, standing up and hugging his daughter tightly. Congratulations, my girl, I'm so happy. And the father? Asked Laura. It's Charles, my college boyfriend. You like him? Of course we do, said Margaret. When are you getting married? In 2 months, and I want all 3 of you to walk me down the aisle. All 3? Asked Richard. All 3. I can't choose which of my parents should do it, so I want all of you with me. And so, 2 months later, in a small church filled with flowers, Isabel walked down the aisle accompanied by Richard, Margaret, and Laura. The groom Charles waited at the altar with a huge smile, and in the front row sat Mrs. Eleanor, who had become part of the family, and Dr. Henry Mitchell, who had become a dear friend. When the priest asked, "Who gives this bride away?" the three answered in unison, "We do." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. 6 months later, when their first grandchild was born, Richard held the baby in his arms while Margaret and Laura argued over who would change the diaper first. "What are we naming him?" Richard asked Isabel. "Gabriel," she replied, "like the angel who protects families." "Gabriel," repeated Margaret. "Perfect. And will he have 3 grandparents too?" Laura teased. 3 grandparents, 1 grandfather, and lots of love," Isabel confirmed, "just like his mother had." That afternoon, as 4 generations gathered in the same room, everyone understood they had witnessed the most beautiful proof that true love always finds a way to bring together those meant to be. Richard looked out the window of the house and saw the golden sunset painting the sky. 6 years ago, he had been a bitter and lonely man. Today, he was surrounded by the most loving family he could imagine. Margaret rocked her little grandson and softly hummed a lullaby. 6 years ago, she had been a desperate woman begging for shelter. Today, she had a home filled with love and purpose. Laura helped Isabel organize the baby's things. 6 years ago, she had lived in fear of losing her daughter. Today, she knew she had gained an entire family. And Isabel, at the center of it all, looked at the 3 people who loved her and at the son she had just welcomed, knowing she was the luckiest woman in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, not addressing anyone in particular. "For what?" Richard asked. "For not giving up, for finding a way to make it work. For showing me that family is about love, not perfection. Thank you," Margaret said, "for teaching us that forgiveness is possible, that love always wins, and that a family can be rebuilt, even after years apart." "And thank you," Laura said to Richard, "for not being angry with me for running away with her." "And thank you," Richard said to Laura, "for taking such good care of our daughter all these years." At that moment, little Gabriel opened his eyes for the first time and looked at each of his grandparents as if memorizing every face, every smile, every tear of joy. "Welcome to our crazy family, my love," Isabel whispered to her son. "You'll have more love than you know what to do with." And as the sun set outside, inside that house there was only light, the light of unconditional love, of chosen family, of hope that never fades, and the certainty that no matter how many storms life brings, where there is true love, there is always a way to begin again. The woman who had once asked to sweep a house in exchange for shelter had found far more than a roof over her head. She had found what she had always searched for, a place where she belonged, people who loved her, and the certainty that she would never be alone again. And the man who had once refused help to a desperate stranger had learned the most important lesson of his life, that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as problems, and that true love always finds its way home. The end. Now, tell us what you thought of this story and where you're following us from. If you have something to share, leave us a sincere comment. Do you believe Richard made the right choice in helping Margaret? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to like this video and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories.